This video will show you how to replace the front steering knuckle on a Pontiac Grand Prix. This is part of the front steering and suspension located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we have to do is safely raise and support the front end of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and we can get the wheel off of here. Now that we have the wheel out of position, let's use a spacer and one of our lug nuts to hold our brake rotor in place. Once you've done that, that's going to prevent the rotor from falling off. We need to remove our caliper next. Let's have a look along the back side. As we look along the back side of the caliper, we can see our 2 15mm caliper bracket bolts. I'm going to fully remove my first bolt, just a quick inspection. I'm going to start it back in a couple threads, preventing the caliper from falling down as I continue on fully removing the next. Now, as we remove our caliper, have a quick look at our brake pads. Confirm they're not worn at an angle or damaged in a way that they are not usable, in which case you'd want to replace them. These look fine, so I'm going to set this aside, putting no pressure on my flex hose. Now we're preparing to remove our brake rotor, so we're going to remove our lug nut and our spacer. Now this rotor is ready to come off. Commonly, it might be stuck in place up against the wheel bearing hub. If that's the case, you could carefully tap on the hat of the rotor along this area, but do not cause any damage to the braking surface or to your lug studs during the removal process. Remove your brake rotor, give it a quick inspection, we'll set it aside. We're moving along to removing our axle nut. We'll be using a 34mm socket. I'm using an impact tool to remove this mounting nut. If you are attempting to do it by hand, you might find that this wants to spin on you. If that's the case, you want to try to prevent that. You can use a pry bar diagonally past the studs down towards the ground. We'll use some penetrant along the axle and the wheel bearing hub. A hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle shaft. Let's tap on this, breaking the axle shaft free from the wheel bearing. Now that we have movement from there, let's make our way up towards the top of the steering knuckle. Now we're looking at the area that meets up against our front strut assembly. We're going to be using a 21mm for each of our 2 21mm mounting nuts. Once you've removed these, we're going to have to tap the bolts out of position. Just be careful not to cause any damage. Just a quick inspection of that mounting nut. Now, when I tap these out of position, typically I like to have the end of the nut flush with the end of the bolt. Now I'm going to carefully start tapping on this. The bolt itself does have some splines. I like to have the mounting nut on here. It helps prevent damage to the bolt, but it also makes sure that the bolt does not fly out while you're tapping on it. We'll use some penetrant and a hammer. A couple light taps here. There's one. Now I'm going to do the same for the other. As we remove the final piece of hardware, keep in mind this knuckle may want to pull out and away from the vehicle. Be extremely careful. Let's separate this. Now we're pressing the axle out through the backside of the wheel bearing. Of course, I do have some rust on my application and some corrosion, which is hindering my ability. We'll just pry it out as necessary. Now let's continue on to the outer tie rod end. Looking along the bottom area, we can see a castle nut and a cotter pin. We're going to be removing that cotter pin. I'm just going to use some cutters. We'll set that aside for recycling. Use a 17mm for the mounting nut. Now I'm holding onto the steering knuckle. I'm going to tap on the knuckle with my rubber mallet. I want to try to break the tie rod end free from the knuckle without causing any damage to that outer tie rod end. That looks good. We'll set it aside. Now we're going to focus on removing our lower ball joint hardware. So we can see the ball joint nut down in here. This is the same as the outer tie rod end. We have a castle nut. We have to remove the cotter pin first. For the lower ball joint mounting nut, we're using an 18mm. Now we're going to leave the mounting nut on, just a couple threads. We'll use some penetrant down inside where the ball joint stud goes into the steering knuckle. After that, we have to go ahead and separate the ball joint stud from the knuckle itself. The next thing we'll do is apply a little bit of support underneath our front wheel bearing, holding this up. Now up along the top area here, we're going to have to separate the stud. To remove this, commonly people might try to use a pickle fork down in this area, but that could cause damage to the ball joint or the protective boot. Other than that, you could have a ball joint stud puller, or you could just continue on with your socket. We're going to put it on here. We're going to lightly tap down on this. It should want to break it free for us. There we are. We have some movement from that. Now I'm going to be holding onto my steering knuckle so it does not fall down. I'm going to remove the lower ball joint mounting nut and we'll lift this up and away. Let's get this over to the bench. With the steering knuckle and wheel bearing on the bench, I want to hold this still, so I have it in a vise. You can also have a helper. Once you have it so it does not move around, we can continue on removing the 3 pieces of hardware holding the wheel bearing to the steering knuckle. We're using a 13mm for each of these bolts. It's a good idea to replace these bolts. A thorough inspection. Now we can carefully remove the bearing from the knuckle. I'm going to release pressure from my vise. Now, sometimes the bearing will slide out of place. Other times you may have to tap it out of place. If you do have to tap it, be careful not to cause damage to the bearing. Once you have the bearing out, continue on to removing the small plate located behind it. And there it is, friend. Let's have a quick look at the flange on the wheel bearing. We want to make sure there isn't any raised areas. Let's go ahead and clean this down. If you find anything, you can sand it down as necessary. This looks good. Of course, we'll clean and inspect this plate as well. Both sides. Nice. Let's install the plate on our bearing. I'm going to align this with all 3 of my mounting bolt ports. Now, when we go to put this onto the knuckle, this area would be down along the bottom of the knuckle. This is over towards where the outer tie rod end would be. We'll bring the brand new knuckle into place. Now we're going to start in all 3 pieces of hardware. Okay, there's 1, 2, and the 3rd. Now I'm going to install this into the vise. Let's snug them down. After they're snug, torque them to 96 foot-pounds. On to the next 2. All 3 pieces of hardware are secured. We know we have the plate in the proper position. Let's get this over to the vehicle. We'll get the steering knuckle in place along the top of the ball joint stud. Start on the ball joint mounting nut. Once you have that started on, bottom it out. The torque for that is 15 foot-pounds. After you've torqued that to 15 foot-pounds, you need to continue on an additional 1/3 of a turn, or 120 degrees. Now to torque this, you may find that the steering knuckle wants to spin on you, so I'm just using an awl, but you can also use a flat blade screwdriver if necessary. Just go straight through that steering knuckle. Now we can torque this to that 15 foot-pounds. Now that we have that torqued, let's continue on that additional 1/3 of a turn. Now continuing on, we need to pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the port leading through the stud of the ball joint. We have to install our cotter pin. If the slot isn't properly aligned, continue tightening the mounting nut until the very next slot is, and then install your locking cotter pin. Let's see if this fits in. I'm just looking for the port for this. I think it's on that side. Let's come right through here. Nice. Of course, this could come through from any direction. It really just depends on the angle of the stud. Let's go ahead and pin this over. Make sure that that is in place. We do not want this nut loosening up while you're driving down the road. This looks good. Sticking with the sequence of how we removed this, let's continue on with the installation of the outer tie rod end next. Castle nut down along the bottom. With that started on, we'll snug it up, torque it to 34 foot-pounds. I'm going to be holding the top. Now we can torque this down. Just as with the other castle nut, we need to make sure the slot aligns with our port so we can install our cotter pin. If it's not, just continue tightening until the very next slot is. Our cotter pin does line up. And we're secure. Now it's time to get the axle shaft inside along the rear of the wheel bearing. We want to slide it straight through the wheel bearing, and then we're going to take our steering knuckle and pull it up towards our front strut so we can install our hardware from the front towards the rear. Okay, let's pay attention up along the top here. This is looking good. 2 pieces of hardware. Line it up, slide them through. Now what I'm attempting to do is tap the splined area of each one of the bolts into the steering knuckle. That's going to help prevent these from spinning while we continue along the rearward side with our 2 mounting nuts. Let's make our way there next. Now we can install our 2 mounting nuts on the rearward side, and we'll torque them to 89 foot-pounds. There's that one. Let's make our way up to the next. And my torque wrench, 89 foot-pounds. Now, prior to installing our brake rotor, we need to make sure we clean and inspect our wheel bearing hub surface. Use some parts cleaner and a wire brush. We're attempting to remove any raised surfaces. Let's apply some anti-seize to the wheel bearing hub mating surface. Just make your way around. A thin coating should do. So now we're looking at the back side of our brake rotor. We need to make sure we clean and inspect the area where our wheel bearing hub would sit. We'll use some parts cleaner. Let's get our brake rotor in place. Once you have it on there, we're going to hold it in place using a spacer and one of our original lug nuts. We're moving along to installing the caliper next. The caliper is going to slide over the brake rotor, and we have to install our 2 mounting bolts. We'll bring this down into position. Now we're going to start in both of our mounting bolts. Once they're both started in, we can snug them up and then torque them to 133 foot-pounds. Now let's remove our lug nut and spacer. Now it's time for the axle nut. When you go to install it, you may find that this wants to spin on you. You can prevent that in different ways. You could either press on the brake pedal. You could also use a pry bar directly down towards the ground at an angle, or you could use a screwdriver inside the fins of the rotor, down along the bottom area here. That will help prevent it from turning if you rest it against that caliper. Time for the axle nut. When we go to install the axle nut, you want to make sure you use a hand tool for this. We're not using an impact tool that could cause damage to the bearing. Okay, let's get this to an area we can torque it. Now I'll torque that to 118 foot-pounds. Let's reinstall our wheel. Start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. Once you have them all started on, snug them up. We'll get the wheel back on the ground and then torque each lug nut to 100 foot-pounds. Now that I have the wheel back on the ground, I'm going to be torquing each one of my lug nuts to that 100 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Torqued.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.